When rescue workers found this baby elephant, he was shaking uncontrollably and refused to eat, with veterinarians giving him just days to live. But when they placed one simple object near him, what happened next left everyone in tears and changed elephant rescue forever. So, what was this mysterious item that saved his life when medicine couldn't? The transport truck rolled through the gates of the Elephant Nature Park as the morning sun broke over the mountains of northern Thailand. Inside the vehicle, wrapped in silver emergency sheets and lying on dried hay, was the smallest elephant the sanctuary had seen in months. Navan was only 6 weeks old, found 3 days earlier, wandering alone near the border with Myanmar. His body was thin, his ribs showing through loose skin that should have been round and full. Cuts and scrapes covered his legs from trying to keep up with a herd that could not wait for him during the terrible drought. Lek Chilert stood at the gate with her team of elephant keepers and veterinary doctors. She was 60 years old and had spent 40 years saving Asian elephants from logging camps, street begging, and cruel tourist shows. But baby elephants without mothers were the hardest cases she ever faced. These tiny animals needed more than food and medicine. They needed the kind of love and comfort that only came from their mothers and elephant families. When the truck doors opened, everyone saw just how bad things were. Navan was even smaller than the reports had said, probably born too early or to a mother who did not have enough food. His eyes looked empty and far away, like animals who had given up hope. But the worst part was how he shook. Even though the air was warm, his small body trembled like he was freezing cold. Without his mother's huge, warm body next to him, he could not stay warm. Dr. Precha Phuangkum, the head veterinarian, started checking Navan right away while 2 keepers gently lifted him from the truck. The baby elephant did not fight or cry out for his mother. He made no sound at all. This silence scared Lek more than anything. Elephants who had stopped fighting were much harder to save than elephants who still had some spirit left. The medical tests showed terrible problems. Navan had not drunk enough water for days. His eyes looked sunken, and his mouth was dry. His feet were cracked and bleeding from walking on rough ground without the herd to protect him. Blood tests showed his body was shutting down from lack of food and water. But the doctors could fix these physical problems with the right medicine and care. The emotional damage was something else entirely. Baby elephants in the wild spend their first 3 years touching their mothers almost all the time. This closeness gives them more than warmth and milk. It helps their brains grow properly and teaches them how to handle scary feelings. When this connection is broken too soon, the baby elephant can suffer in ways that look just like human trauma. Orphaned calves often cannot sleep, refuse to eat, and pull away from everyone around them. The team moved Navan into the special baby elephant area with soft sand on the ground, shade from the hot sun, and a warm place to sleep. They had prepared everything by the rules. Bottles of special elephant milk, soft hay for bedding, even recordings of mother elephants calling to their babies. But as they settled Navan into his space, the little calf just stood completely still. His trunk hung down limp, and his eyes stared at nothing. Lek knelt down beside the baby elephant and spoke to him in the soft, musical sounds of her northern Thai language. She had learned from her grandmother that elephants did not understand words but felt the kindness in someone's voice. She told Navan he was safe now, that he would never be left alone again, that this place would become his home and family. The calf's ears moved slightly toward the sound, but nothing else about him changed. The first attempt to feed him confirmed Lek's worst fears. When they offered him the bottle of warm milk, Navan turned his head away. He showed no interest in the food that should have made him want to drink right away. The team tried everything they knew. They changed how warm the milk was, made it thicker or thinner, had different people try to feed him, even tried putting small amounts right into his mouth. Nothing worked. Navan had decided to give up, and no amount of human help seemed able to change his mind. As the sun went down on that first day, Navan stood alone in his pen, still shaking, even though the workers had put blankets on his back. He had not eaten, barely drunk any water, and showed no interest in looking around his new home. Nope. The night workers settled in to watch him all night, checking for any signs he was getting worse or needed emergency help. But trouble came from a place no one expected. Around midnight, Navan suddenly began to scream, not the healthy sounds of a normal elephant, but high, frightened cries that spoke of deep fear and confusion. He started moving wildly around the pen, bumping into walls like he could not see them or understand where he was. The blankets the staff had put on him fell off during his panic, and his shaking got worse. Jokia, one of the sanctuary's old rescue elephants who lived next door, answered Navan's cries with deep, rumbling sounds of her own. Jokia was blind, her eyes destroyed years ago by cruel handlers who had used her for illegal logging. Despite her own suffering, she had become like a mother to new animals at the sanctuary, offering comfort with her gentle presence and patient wisdom. Her calls seemed to calm Navan a little, but without being able to touch him, her comfort could only do so much. Dr. Preacha gave Navan medicine to help him get through the night without hurting himself. But everyone there understood that medicine was not a real answer, just a temporary fix to keep the calf safe until morning. As the doctor prepared the shot, Lek made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow they would try something different, something based on old traditional knowledge passed down through generations of elephant keepers, but never tested or written down in any science book. Would this ancient wisdom hold the key to reaching a baby elephant who had lost all hope? Or was Navan already too far gone to save? The next morning, Lex stood in her office, surrounded by stacks of research papers and notebooks from decades of elephant care. But she was not looking at modern science journals or behavior studies. Instead, she held an old worn notebook that had belonged to her grandmother, filled with observations about elephant behavior written in careful Thai handwriting. One page, marked with a faded ribbon, described something that traditional Mahout families had used for generations when caring for orphaned or hurt baby elephants. The practice involved what the old handlers called a spirit cloth or soul blanket. According to the tradition, baby elephants formed powerful memories based on touch that connected with safety and their mothers. In the wild, calves spent their early weeks pressed against their mother's belly, learning her texture, smell, and warmth. When a calf lost its mother, the traditional practice was to give them a substitute object that could fill this same need, something that would become connected with safety, comfort, and the promise of staying alive. But the blanket could not be just any fabric. The tradition said it must be soft enough to feel like skin, large enough to wrap around the calf's body, and most importantly, it had to be offered in a specific way that would let the elephant claim it as his own, rather than having it forced on him. The grandmother's notes stressed that the blanket had to become the elephant's choice, his treasure, something he could control in a world where everything else had been taken from him. Lek called her team together and explained what she wanted to try. Some of the younger staff members did not believe it would work, thinking it was just superstition rather than real science. But Dr. Preacha, who had worked with Lek long enough to trust her feelings, pointed out that the idea made sense. Comfort objects, as they were called in human child psychology, gave emotional security and helped hurt people cope with stress and change. If it worked for human children, why not for elephant calves? Finding the perfect blanket became the morning's most important task. They needed something specific, large enough to cover Navan's small body, soft enough to give comfort, strong enough to survive elephant handling, and hopefully in a color or texture that might appeal to how elephants see. The team searched through the sanctuary supply rooms, looked at donations from supporters, and even visited local markets in Chiang Mai, looking for the right material. Fawn, one of the senior keepers who had grown up in a traditional elephant family, suggested they visit his aunt's cloth workshop. The woman had been weaving traditional northern Thai fabrics for over 50 years and understood how different materials felt and behaved. When Lek explained what they needed, the old weaver disappeared into her storage room and came back with a blanket she had made years earlier but never sold. The blanket was special. Woven from a mix of cotton and bamboo fiber, it had a texture that was both soft and slightly rough, copying the different surfaces an elephant calf might feel when pressed against its mother. The color was a warm gray-brown, similar to elephant skin. Most amazing, the weaver had put in a traditional pattern that created small ridges and valleys in the fabric, giving it a bumpy quality that would give different feelings to touch. The blanket measured about 6 feet square, large enough to wrap around a baby elephant completely. But the weaver said one more thing was needed. Following the old traditions, she spent an hour treating the blanket with a mixture of natural oils and herbs that were said to have calming effects. The mixture included lemongrass, which elephants naturally liked, along with turmeric and other traditional ingredients. Whether these additions actually worked or were just symbolic, they represented the collected wisdom of generations who had cared for elephants long before modern veterinary science existed. Back at the sanctuary, Lek prepared to introduce the blanket with the same careful planning one might use for an important medical procedure. Rather than simply putting it over Navan, she would need to present it in a way that let the calf investigate and claim it on his own terms. This required patience and a willingness to let the elephant set the pace, even if that pace was frustratingly slow. The team gathered at Navan's pen in the late morning, when the sun had warmed the air, but before the midday heat became too strong. The calf was in the same position he had stayed in since his arrival, standing still near the center of his space, sometimes shaking despite the warm temperature. His condition had not gotten better overnight, and Dr. Preach's morning check showed he kept losing weight, and his vital signs kept getting worse. Time was running out. Lek entered the pen alone, carrying the folded blanket over her arm. She moved slowly, speaking in her usual, low soothing tones, though she expected no response from Navan. Rather than walking straight toward the elephant, she went to a spot about 10 feet away and sat down on the ground, making herself smaller and less scary. This was another part of the traditional approach, letting the elephant keep control of personal space and how close things got. For several minutes, Lex simply sat with the blanket in her lap, sometimes running her hands over its surface, making soft rustling sounds. Navan's ears flickered slightly, following the noise, but he made no move toward her. Patience was everything. According to her grandmother's notes, the elephant needed to become curious about the object before he could form a connection to it. Forcing contact would destroy any chance of the blanket becoming a source of comfort. After maybe 15 minutes, Lek carefully unfolded the blanket and spread it on the ground between herself and Navan. The fabric caught the breeze slightly, making gentle movement and releasing the subtle smell of lemongrass and herbs. This was the critical moment, the point where the elephant would either show interest or stay locked in his hurt withdrawal. The staff watching from outside the pen held their breath, afraid that any sound might break the fragile possibility starting to form. Navan's trunk lifted slightly from its hanging position. His nose holes opened wide, processing the smell carried on the air. It was the first purposeful movement he had made since his arrival, the first sign that something in his surroundings had broken through the wall of sadness around him. The reaction was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone not watching with total focus, but to Lek it meant a crack had formed in the fortress of Navan's grief. Lek stayed completely still, fighting every urge to encourage or coax the elephant forward. The traditional wisdom was clear. The elephant must make the first move completely on his own. Any human pushing at this stage would turn the blanket from a treasure to be claimed into another thing, being forced on him by the strange creatures who had taken him from everything he knew. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Navan's trunk stayed raised, swaying slightly as he processed smell and air movement. Then, so slowly that the movement was almost impossible to see, he took a single step forward. His foot touched down carefully, testing the ground as if he no longer trusted the earth beneath him. But it was movement, chosen movement, the first time since his rescue that he had decided to change his position for any reason other than panic. Another step, then another. Navan was coming toward the blanket with the careful curiosity of a baby meeting something completely new. His trunk reached out further, the sensitive tip exploring the air above the fabric without quite touching it. Lek could see the fight playing out in the calf's body, the desire to investigate battling with the fear of engaging with anything in this strange new world. When Navan's trunk finally made contact with the blanket, just brushing the edge of the fabric, something remarkable happened. The elephant froze in place, his entire body going stiff as he tried to understand this new feeling. The soft texture, the subtle smell, the gentle give of the fabric under his trunk, all combined to create a sensation that was somehow familiar despite being completely new. It was not his mother's skin, but it reminded him of something deep in his baby memory, about safety and comfort. Would this simple piece of woven fabric finally break through the walls of hurt that had trapped Navan's will to survive? The change in Navan was not sudden or dramatic, but rather opened over the next several hours, like a flower turning toward the sun. After that first careful touch, the baby elephant spent nearly 20 minutes simply exploring the blanket with his trunk, learning its texture and edges. His movements were delicate, almost respectful, as if he understood on some deep level that this object was being offered as a gift rather than forced on him as a requirement. Lex stayed sitting nearby, a quiet witness to the elephant's investigation. She had been trained by her grandmother to recognize the subtle signs of elephant thinking, the particular angle of the ears showing focus, the rhythm of breathing that meant calculation rather than fear, the specific trunk movements that meant checking rather than rejection. All these signs were present in Navan's behavior, showing that something important was happening in his young mind. The breakthrough came when Navan, after his long exploration, suddenly grabbed a corner of the blanket with his trunk and pulled it toward himself. The movement was clear and purposeful, the first truly intentional action he had taken since his rescue. He pulled the fabric until it partly covered his front legs, then stood still, as if thinking about what to do next. After a moment, he lowered himself to the ground, a complicated process for a baby elephant that requires coordination and trust in the surroundings. Once lying down, Navan moved the blanket with surprising skill, using his trunk to pull it over his body until he was almost completely covered. The effect showed immediately in his body. The constant shaking that had troubled him since arrival stopped within minutes. His breathing, which had been shallow and uneven, deepened into a more natural rhythm. Most remarkably, his trunk, which had hung limp and lifeless for days, curled protectively around a fold of the blanket, holding it close to his body in a way that spoke of ownership and connection. Lex slowly stood and backed toward the pen exit, signaling to her team that they should leave Navan alone. As she came out of the pen, she found Dr. Precha and the keepers staring in amazement at the change they had witnessed. The doctor admitted that while he had hoped the blanket might give some comfort, he had not expected such an immediate and deep response. Navan had claimed the blanket as his own, and in doing so had given himself a reason to connect with the world again. Over the next few hours, the staff watched Navan from a careful distance, writing down every interaction with his new treasure. The elephant did not leave the blanket or let it be removed from right next to him. When keepers entered the pen to bring fresh water and food, Navan would gather the blanket closer, protecting it even as he ignored the offerings meant for his own needs. The blanket had become more than a comfort object. It represented the one thing in his scary new reality that belonged completely to him. The real test came during the afternoon feeding attempt. Previous efforts had been met with complete disinterest, with Navan turning away from bottles and food despite his obvious need for nutrition. But this time, when Fawn came close with a bottle of warm elephant milk, Navan stayed lying down with his blanket. The keeper knelt beside the calf and offered the bottle, not pushing it toward the elephant's mouth, but simply making it available while speaking in soft, encouraging tones. What happened next brought tears to the eyes of several watching staff members. Navan, without letting go of his blanket, reached out his trunk and wrapped it around the bottle. He pulled it toward himself with the same possessive motion he had used to claim the blanket, bringing it under the fabric as if adding it to his protected space. Then finally, he began to drink. The first few swallows were careful and small, but as the warm milk reached his empty stomach, instinct took over, and he began feeding for real. The bottle was empty within 5 minutes, faster than anyone had dared hope. When Fawn offered a second bottle, Navan took it with less hesitation, his confidence growing with each successful feeding. By the end of the session, he had drunk more nutrition than he had in the previous 3 days, combined. The physical relief was clear in his body, but more important was what the feeding meant. Navan had chosen to survive. The blanket had given him something worth staying alive for, and that single point of connection was starting to rebuild his will to engage with life. Dr. Precha did an evening examination and found measurable improvements in Navan's vital signs. His water levels were better, his temperature had become stable, and his blood work showed the beginning of recovery from the dangerous imbalances that had threatened his life. But beyond the medical data, there was something less easy to measure, but equally important: hope. The elephant's eyes, which had been dull and empty, now showed flickers of awareness and interest in his surroundings. As darkness fell over the sanctuary, the staff prepared for what they hoped would be Navan's first peaceful night. They left him in his pen with his precious blanket, watching him through night cameras to avoid disturbing his rest. The video captured moments that would become legendary among the sanctuary staff. Navan carefully arranged and rearranged his blanket, making sure every fold was exactly as he wanted it. He would spread it out completely, then gather it up again, making different shapes as if trying to find the perfect setup for sleeping. Eventually, he created a nest-like structure, piling the blanket in the center of his sleeping area, and then lying down with his body partly on top of it and partly surrounded by it. His trunk stayed wrapped around a corner throughout the night, keeping physical contact with his treasure, even in sleep. The cameras captured him sleeping more deeply than he had since his rescue, with none of the restless movements or distress sounds that had marked previous nights. The change continued to speed up over the following days. Each morning, Navan would wake and immediately check on his blanket, using his trunk to investigate every fold and corner as if making sure it had not disappeared during the night. This ritual became his morning routine, more important even than food or water. Only after confirming his blanket was safe and complete would he show interest in other activities. Feeding sessions became steadily easier as Navan learned to connect the keepers with positive experiences rather than threats. The key was letting him keep his blanket during feedings, creating a sense of security that made him willing to accept human closeness. The staff adapted their care routines around this requirement, understanding that the blanket was not a temporary comfort aid, but a basic part of Navan's emotional recovery. But the blanket's importance went beyond simple comfort. Lek observed that Navan was using it as a tool for managing his emotions in ways that copied how baby elephants use their mothers in the wild. When something startled or frightened him, maybe a sudden noise or an unfamiliar person coming near, he would immediately seek his blanket, pulling it over his head or wrapping his trunk around it until the threat passed. The blanket was teaching him that he could manage his own emotional responses, that he had resources for calming himself, even without a mother elephant, to provide that regulation. The sanctuary's resident elephants also seemed to understand the blanket's importance. Jokia, the old blind elephant who had called to Navan on his first night, would rumble approvingly whenever she sensed him interacting with his treasure. Other elephants who passed near his pen would pause and reach their trunks toward the distinctive gray-brown fabric, as if acknowledging its significance. In the complex social world of elephants, where empathy and emotional awareness are highly developed, the herd seemed to recognize that Navan had found something precious that was helping him heal. As Navan's physical health improved, his personality began to emerge. The staff discovered that beneath the trauma lay a naturally curious and intelligent calf with a particular fascination for textures and objects. He would collect small items in his pen, sticks, leaves, even toys provided by caretakers, and arrange them near his blanket as if creating a personal space that showed his growing sense of identity and control. The blanket remained the centerpiece of this collection, but it was no longer his only treasure. It was the foundation on which he was rebuilding his relationship with the world. Dr. Precha noted in his medical logs that Navan's recovery path exceeded all expectations. Weight gain was steady and healthy. His cracked feet healed completely. Blood work returned to normal ranges, but more significantly, behavior signs showed an elephant who was learning to trust again, who could experience pleasure and curiosity, and who had developed healthy ways of managing stress. The blanket had provided the anchor point from which all other recovery had become possible. 3 weeks after his arrival, Navan took his first steps outside his pen, going into the larger baby area where he could interact with other young elephants under supervision. The condition for this expansion of his world was non-negotiable. His blanket had to come with him. The keepers built a special carrying system that let them transport the blanket wherever Navan went, making sure his security object stayed accessible as he explored new environments and situations. But how would Navan respond when faced with the ultimate test, learning to form bonds with other elephants while still depending on his treasured blanket for emotional security? Bringing Navan into the sanctuary's young elephant group presented challenges that required patience, creativity, and respect for the calf's continuing need for his blanket. The baby herd had 6 other orphaned elephants ranging in age from 8 months to 3 years, each with their own trauma histories and behavior quirks. The youngest, May Bua, had been rescued from a tourist camp where she had been forcibly separated from her mother at birth. The oldest, Doc Rock, had been injured in a poaching incident that killed his entire family group. These elephants had learned to find comfort in each other, forming bonds that substituted for the family structures stolen from them by human cruelty and bad luck. Lek understood that for Navan to thrive long-term, he would need to develop these elephant-to-elephant relationships. No human help, no matter how well meant, could replace the complex social learning that came from being part of an elephant family. But she also knew that forcing the integration before Navan was ready could undo all the progress the blanket had enabled. The solution required a gradual approach that honored both Navan's need for his security object and his equal need for connection with his own species. The first introductions happened with the blanket serving as both a real and symbolic buffer between Navan and the other elephants. The keepers would spread the blanket in a neutral area of the baby compound, and Navan would position himself on or near it, while the other elephants were allowed to approach at their own pace. This setup gave Navan the confidence to stay calm during encounters, knowing his anchor point was right there if he became overwhelmed. The other elephants showed remarkable sensitivity to Navan's attachment to the blanket. May Bua, the youngest female, seemed particularly drawn to both Navan and his treasured fabric. She would approach slowly, reaching out her trunk in the traditional elephant greeting gesture, but always stopping short of actually touching the blanket itself. It was as if she understood naturally that the object was sacred space that required invitation rather than assumption. Her patience was eventually rewarded when Navan, after several days of these careful encounters, reached his own trunk toward her in response, starting their first true elephant-to-elephant contact. Doc Rock, the group's eldest and a natural leader despite his own trauma, took a different approach. Rather than trying to interact with Navan directly, he would position himself nearby and do normal elephant behaviors, searching for food, dust bathing, playing with logs, and other toys. His presence provided a model of elephant normalcy, showing Navan what healthy elephant behavior looked like. Sometimes, Doc Rock would make sounds, using the low rumbles that elephants use for reassuring communication within family groups. These sounds seemed to comfort Navan, his ears turning toward Doc Rock, even when his body stayed close to his blanket. The breakthrough in Navan's social integration came during a rain shower, a common event during Thailand's rainy season. The other elephants celebrated the rain with typical elephant joy, trumpeting happily and rolling in the mud made by the downpour. Navan, at first cautious, watched from his position near the blanket, which the keepers had moved under a shelter to keep it dry. The sight of the other elephants playing triggered something in Navan's young memory. Perhaps a dim recollection of similar moments with his birth herd before the drought and abandonment that had led to his rescue. Carefully, Navan took a few steps away from his blanket toward where the other calves were playing. May Bua noticed immediately and trumpeted an invitation, splashing enthusiastically in a muddy puddle. For the first time since his arrival, Navan responded with his own call, a small trumpet that spoke of curiosity and careful joy. He walked further from his blanket, testing his ability to separate from his security object, and then, in a moment that brought sudden applause from the watching staff, he ran toward the group and began playing in the mud alongside them. The play session lasted only about 10 minutes before Navan's anxiety about being away from his blanket overcame his enjoyment of the social interaction. He suddenly broke away from the group and ran back to where his treasure waited under the shelter. But those 10 minutes represented a huge step. He had chosen, voluntarily, to engage with other elephants even when it meant temporarily leaving his security object. The blanket was no longer his only source of comfort. It was becoming one option among several. Still important, but no longer his sole lifeline. Over the following months, this pattern repeated and expanded. Navan would venture away from his blanket for steadily longer periods, exploring the sanctuary grounds and deepening his relationships with the other elephants. But he always returned to his treasure, especially during times of stress or uncertainty. The blanket remained his home base, the fixed point in his universe that made exploration and risk-taking possible. The keepers observed that his departures from the blanket seemed to follow a predictable cycle, as if he was testing and expanding his comfort zone in measured steps. As Navan grew larger and stronger, the practical challenges of keeping his relationship with the blanket evolved. The fabric that had seemed so large when he was a tiny calf now appeared smaller as he approached 440 pounds. The keepers realized that the blanket could not physically grow with Navan, but his psychological attachment showed no signs of weakening. The solution came from an unexpected source. The weaver who had provided the original blanket offered to create a second one, identical in texture and color, but larger in size. The introduction of the second blanket was handled with the same care as the original. Rather than simply replacing the first blanket, the keepers presented the new one alongside it, letting Navan investigate and claim the addition on his own terms. His response showed the sophistication of elephant thinking. He recognized immediately that the new blanket was similar to his original treasure, using his trunk to compare textures and smells. After a thorough investigation, he began using both blankets together, sometimes lying on one while covering himself with the other, creating an even more elaborate nest than before. But the most remarkable development came when May Bua, Navan's closest friend among the young elephants, showed interest in the blankets during a particularly hot afternoon. The two calves had been resting in the shade when May Bua reached toward the edge of one blanket with her trunk. Navan's first reaction was protective, pulling the fabric closer to himself. But then, in a gesture that spoke volumes about his emotional growth, he used his trunk to pull a corner of the blanket toward May Bua, offering to share his most precious possession with his friend. This sharing behavior marked a fundamental shift in Navan's relationship with the blanket. It was no longer purely a security object he hoarded for personal comfort. It had become something he could use to build connections, to offer comfort to others, to participate in the back-and-forth caregiving that characterizes healthy elephant social structures. The blanket was teaching him not just how to receive comfort, but how to provide it, preparing him for the complex social roles he would need to fill as an adult elephant. As years passed, Navan matured into a healthy, well-adjusted young elephant. His bond with the sanctuary's elephant family deepened, and he became particularly close to several of the females who took on mother-like roles in his life. But the blankets, now numbering 3, as his size continued to increase, remained important parts of his daily routine. Each evening, he would gather them carefully and arrange them in his sleeping area, a ritual that connected him to that desperate baby who had first claimed a piece of fabric as his reason to survive. The story of Navan and his blanket spread throughout the global elephant conservation community. Other sanctuaries began trying similar approaches for traumatized calves, creating protocols based on the traditional wisdom that Lek had revived. Research papers were published documenting the effectiveness of comfort objects in wildlife rehabilitation. The simple idea that a blanket could save an elephant's life had opened new avenues for understanding and treating trauma in wild animals. Visitors to the Elephant Nature Park often asked to see Navan and hear his story. The staff would point him out among the sanctuary's elephants, usually easy to spot by the blanket or blankets he kept nearby even while eating or playing. People were moved by the sight of this massive animal, now weighing over a ton, still keeping such tender care for the pieces of fabric that had once saved his life. Parents would photograph their children standing near Navan's pen, using his story to teach lessons about resilience, the importance of having something to hold on to during difficult times, and the power of small comforts to sustain us through trauma. Years after his rescue, Navan lived peacefully at the sanctuary surrounded by his adopted family and his treasured blankets. The tiny calf, who had been too broken to eat, too traumatized to connect, had grown into a confident elephant who understood both how to receive comfort and how to offer it. His story, born from the simple act of offering a blanket to a dying baby, had changed lives, both elephant and human, proving that sometimes the most powerful interventions are the simplest ones, born from compassion, patience, and the willingness to try something unconventional when traditional approaches fail. How many other lives might be saved if we learned to recognize the simple, unexpected things that could become anchors of hope for those who have lost everything?